Yeah.
Grandpa, I think me and then also a lot of the family has always been curious in your actual full story, and I don't think we've ever got more than a couple of bits and pieces. So I think it's pretty fascinating to maybe get to kind of hear maybe a more full rendition of it. I mean, you were born in the Great Depression, Dust Bowl, went through World War II, Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, raised a family, big in the church, banker, came from the farm. You had a lot go on in these 85 years. If you want to bring us back to the beginning.
Yeah, I think my story that is interesting that I can remember started when I was about 5 years old.
Okay.
And I turned 5 in 1941 in April. My grandparents and my parents decided at that point that I was old enough to have a pony. Because we had a farm to keep it on, no problem keeping an extra horse or a pony around. And my grandparents, from my mom's side, who lived in Sheraton, Iowa, which is about 60 miles away, decided they would purchase a pony for me for my birthday.
Okay.
And so my parents and I drove over to Sheraton to pick this pony up. And all we had at that point to haul it in was our car. And so we had an old Plymouth car, and after we selected the pony and put her in the car. Now what we did is we took the back seat out of the car, and so the pony stood upright in the back seat and rode all the way home with us.
I wouldn't fly today.
And the three of us rode in the front seat. And so that was how we got the pony home to our farm. And the farm we lived in was about 9 miles outside of Ottumwa, Iowa, which was about total distance between our farm and the grandparents' house was about 60 miles.
Wow.
And then we go to my first day of school. It was kindergarten in September of 1941. And I rode my pony Midget to school. Since I lived about a half mile away, they helped me get on the pony and got me on the pony, and I rode down the road to my grandparents' house, where my grandfather met me out there and took the pony and took care of it while I went to school, which was right next door. If you're showing the photograph here, you can see where I would park my pony. It was kept in what they call the chicken lot there, and right next to the chicken lot then was the schoolhouse. And so I walked to my school.
Oh, wow. So this is the schoolhouse.
That is the schoolhouse. And the school, it was just a one classroom schoolhouse. There were two outhouses, one for the boys, one for the girls. You can see the boys' one still out here. There was no heat in there. It was heated by a big potbelly stove in the middle of the schoolhouse. So the teacher or somebody had to get there and build a fire in the winter weather to make sure the school was reasonably warm for the students when we got there. And there was no electricity in the schoolhouse. And so on cloudy days, there were a couple big lamps on the wall, the kerosene lanterns, and the teacher would have to light those to give us a little bit more light in the school on a really cloudy day because there's no electricity. There was no running water in the school. And so there was a hand pump outside the front of the door of the schoolhouse, and I don't think you can see it here. It probably was gone by the time this picture was taken. But that's how we got. If you needed some water in the school, that's where we got water. And that was pretty much my story in the school.
Well, how many kids are at this school?
Normally, there were probably 7 or 8 kids attended school. Now, the teacher had to teach 8 classes plus kindergarten.
Wow!
But he didn't have kids in all the classes, so that cut the number down. But she probably still would have to prepare lesson plans for 4 or 5 different classes, which had to be a difficult task. And back in our school was called Pleasant Grove Number 3. But my uncle who had attended school there said, when we were in school there, we called it Buzzard's Roost. And the teachers in Iowa only had to have 2 years of college to be a school teacher. And they were normally young and a few years out of college, and they would normally rent a room from my grandmother because the house was right next door there.
Oh,
And
so-
she would rent them a room,
Wow.
and they would do their teaching.
Seems a little
And-
lonely.
I don't really know who got up and built that fire for this for the schoolhouse, but I would guess my dad did it sometimes. We had a hired man that helped milk cows. Maybe he did it sometimes. Maybe the school teacher went over and did it sometimes. And behind the schoolhouse, it's gone now. Also, there was a coal house where he kept the coal stored. So you got a bucket of coal and bring the coal in and build a fire in the potbelly stove. Was how we
Wow.
operated back then.
So did you meet a lot of friends there, or is it? Because the farm life seems a little isolated for sure, and maybe lonely. Now today, kids have 100, 200, 500, 600 kids in their grade, right? And you didn't have any.
I didn't have anybody in my grade, and that was another bit of the story, but I'll get to that a little later on. In November 1941, my grandfather from my mom's side had a severe heart attack and was taken to the hospital in Des Moines, Iowa. We visited my grandfather on December 7th, 1941, along with my mom's sister and her husband Bob, who currently lived in Wisconsin at that point. They had come down to see my ailing granddad that was on life support
Wow.
in the hospital in Des Moines. And so they visited them. And then my dad, the farmer, had to leave in the afternoon to get home to do the chores and milk the cows, because you can't leave the cows unmilked even if somebody's sick. Somebody has to milk the cows.
For
And
sure.
so Uncle Bob and I and my dad were driving back. And that's when we got news on the radio, which was the only way we got news back then, that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was a huge loss of ships and life. And Pearl Harbor, of course, was the start of World War II. We quickly declared war on Germany and Japan, which changed everybody's lives. The government quickly started drafting many soldiers and sailors, 18 to 35. My dad was exempted as a farmer because food production was considered an essential service. But my Uncle Bob, a school teacher, was drafted into the Navy as an officer because he was a little older. They started rationing everything with ration books, and they rationed gasoline, tires, sugar, coffee, butter, meat, dairy, dried fruit, jams, jellies, shortening, and shoes. With the license stamps, you were only allowed to have one pair of shoes a year. The shoes were normally made out of leather, and so they needed the leather to make army boots for all the troops going overseas. These items were considered hard to get and were needed to equip our Army and Navy. The Navy at that point decided to build a training base near Ottumwa because they needed inland bases.
And Ottumwa is right near where you grew up.
Ottumwa was about 9 miles from where I grew up, and the base was about the same thing. And that's where they trained Navy pilots who practiced their landing and takeoffs from there. So that central base was near Ottumwa, and then they needed landing strips out in the countryside, so they would fly out from the base, make a touch and go landing, and go on to another one and do another touch and go landing to get experience doing landings and takeoffs. And these were twin wing yellow twin wing airplanes. You may see them around once in a while these days in old shows and things like that. And apparently this very stable kind of a plane that you're less likely to kill yourself in than most of the others. But these were all 18-year-old kids that were flying these planes that had very little experience, and so they needed a lot of training. You weren't bringing anybody that had previous training and experience in at that point. And and one of these landing strips, they took part of our farm. So the government rented our farm for a certain time period during World War II, along with a neighboring farm, to make a landing strip where these airplanes could come in and land and take off and do their thing. And an interesting point about that air base in Ottumwa, during a brief time, the second in command was a lieutenant commander, Richard M. Nixon. And he and his wife, Pat, lived in Ottumwa for a while in a rented house while he was doing his Navy thing during World War II. The base was opened in 1942 and closed in 1947.
Do you remember seeing the planes land and stuff
Oh
as a
yeah,
kid?
yeah, oh yeah, sure. I mean, I was 5 years old in '41, and I was 1947. I was 11. So sure, that was and I remember when the lieutenant flew out from the air base and signed the paperwork to turn the farm back over to my dad so we could begin farming again on that land that had been used as a landing strip.
How much of the land was taken?
I think they took about 70 acres from our farm, and they probably took about 80 acres from another farm, so they probably had about 150 acres of.
And how big is your farm?
Our farm back at that point was a 400-acre farm.
Wow.
So, but this was some of the best productive land of the farm. All the farm isn't quite as productive as this was, so they wanted a nice, level, productive.
And was that a sacrifice just as the war effort, or were you guys getting compensated enough for the...
We were paid rent for the farm, but we would have made more if we could have raised crops on the farm.
Oh, wow.
But labor was in short supply back then, so it wasn't so critical that we could rent some space out, because fellows were all being worked on our farm were all being drafted into the service, so they weren't.
So you had a lot of employees on the farm, kind of thing.
We normally had a hired man and his wife, and if he had children, they lived in the small house that was on the farm.
Gotcha.
And so that was typically our employment status. It varied from time to time, and sometimes you couldn't find somebody. Once in a while, they hired a single fellow that my mom had to keep in the house, which she was not too happy doing, but that had to work out too, to have some help from time to time. And our farm was an old McDonald type of farm with dairy cows, beef cows, pigs, sheep, horses, mules, chickens, and a pony named Midget.
Your pony named Midget.
My pony named Midget. And we had one tractor, and a lot of work was still done with horses and mules in 1941.
Really? So you're pulling, like...
Yeah, they're having to pull plows and wagons and cultivate the corn as it came up with horses. A lot of that was still done with horses. And we also had a large garden at that point. So we were growing potatoes, sweet corn, carrots, lettuce, onions, beets, radishes, rhubarb, and tomatoes. We also raised apples and apricots and grapes. And we didn't have to purchase many things to store, because as we had fresh milk and meat and eggs and fruits and vegetables in the summertime. Now the fruits and vegetables, my mom and other ladies would can them and preserve them for the winter, so we had a lot of that to eat in the wintertime. And as far as meat, we normally slaughtered one calf and at least 2 pigs a year for our farm and the farm worker and his family.
So you guys would only eat 1 calf and 2 pigs for an entire year?
Pretty much. I mean, the calves were pretty big, and so so there's a lot of meat in a calf.
Mm-hmm.
But that typically is what we used out in our farm production to feed ourselves.
Would you try to use like all of the animal still, or is?
We used as much as we wanted to. Like my mom didn't like to eat brains.
Okay.
And I didn't like to eat tongues.
Okay.
But the animals we sold to the local meat packing company, they had a big ad on their billboard saying, "We process and use everything in the pig except the squeal."
What's the squeal?
The pig squeal, wee! So they use tail. I don't know if you ever gone into a tavern and eaten pickled pig's feet, but
No.
We sold these to taverns and big jar of pig's feet in vinegar brine, and people would drink their beer and they'd buy a pickled pig foot.
Really? That's like a dog food, though.
And I think some taverns probably still have those in some areas. I don't know.
Pickled pig feet?
Pickled pig feet.
I thought they just do peanuts, you know? Like.
Well, that's the vegetarian way, but
Yeah.
back then almost everybody was a meat eater. We didn't have many vegetarians around in that time period.
It was a little bit different of a a culture because I mean, like you said, like you killed what 3 animals a year, and you fed.
And also we killed chickens.
Oh, okay.
And we raised chickens, and my mom would do that. She had to chop the head off the chicken.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever heard the phrase, he's flopping around like a chicken with his head off.
Yeah.
Well, when a chicken pulled the head off, they let them flop around to bleed out, to get the blood out of the chicken, so that it's easier to. And then you had to prepare a bucket of boiling water, and you dip the dead chicken into the boiling water, and that loosened the feathers, so you could pluck the feathers off, because you didn't want to eat feathers with your chicken.
Yeah. How was seeing all this happen as a kid? How did that change your perspective towards animals and agriculture?
Well, I think it's production agriculture, and the same thing goes on today in certain more sophisticated and large-scale sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the typical farm doesn't have all these different animals. They normally specialize. Like my brother and his children on the farm only grow grains. It's mostly soybeans and corn. A patch of sweet corn and some of this stuff, which is like corn, but except it's bred to be edible, and so it's a lot more edible than what the field corn would be.
So that's what you get at the grocery store.
That's what you buy at the grocery store, is sweet corn, as opposed to the field corn that's used for grain, which again gets fed to animals and made into bread and cornbread and wheat and whatever.
Ethanol.
Yeah, ethanol. Sometimes we grow some wheat, but that pretty much the wheat production normally is done in a little drier area, like in Kansas is the big wheat state, and I think we could make more money by corn and soybeans on our soil and the rainfall that we got in our part of the country, where our farm was located. And I'll get back to the school. Our school normally had 7 or 8 students spread over 4 or 5 grades in one room and one teacher. We had kerosene lamps. When it was clouded, we needed more than sunlight. When I was in 2nd grade, there were 2 boys in the 3rd grade, and I was in the 2nd grade, so the teacher moved me up so it would be easier for her to teach.
So you just skipped 2nd grade altogether.
And later on in my work career, I worked with a lady, and she looked at my poor handwriting and said, "What happened to you? Did you skip 2nd grade?" She was right. And in the school, we had a hand-cranked Victrola for music and a nice selection of music for the time, and a boys and girls coat room. And a lot of patriotic songs were being played during World War II.
Sure.
It's a grand old flag and all that kind of stuff. And so we had a lot of that music.
Were you guys, did patriotism, did that skyrocket during the war?
Oh,
even
yeah.
out in the
Everybody almost was a patriot. If you weren't a patriot, you'd be run out of town.
Really? And was that, I mean, I guess you only really know from like rural Iowa, but was that widespread, or is that more?
It was widespread.
Widespread. And so was it more like, was rural Iowa very, very patriotic compared to like maybe Chicago was, or
Chicago was very patriotic too.
Even it crossed urban and rural areas.
Urban and rural areas, not as divided as it is kind of these days.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1945, when I was in 5th grade, and only 3 students enrolled in my school that year, one family moved away. It was determined that the enrollment was so small, the school should be closed, and we should go to a school in the neighboring town of Agency. We were bused into town initially in a 1929 Model A Ford with large, bright yellow signs designated as a school bus, driven by one of the fathers and an older brother of one of the boys who was in high school. Later on, the school system purchased buses transfer the children from school in the rural area. The school and Agency had 2 grades and 1 teacher per classroom, so that big improvement. So 5th grade, there were like 30 kids in the class.
Wow, and, how was that? Was that a shock that many people existed?
Yeah, it was a lot different. That's what it was, but it still was not a large school, nothing like what these urban schools are today. And there were reasonably large schools if you wanted to go to school in Ottumwa.
Mm.
And
did kids do that?
A few.
Was it better education there?
I think it was, but it was a different education. So
What do you mean by that?
well, it was much more urban and sophisticated. Most of the kids at my school were kind of farm kids.
Okay.
And so, like most farm boys did not do Boy Scouts, but 4-H was a big activity. In 4-H, you had to have a project, which was normally raising an animal. The animal was displayed and judged once a year at the county fair, and you ranked in ribbons. You got a blue ribbon, or a red ribbon, or a yellow ribbon, or a pink ribbon for
Yeah.
how well the judge liked your calf and liked how you displayed him. And on your project, the calf had to be fed, groomed, and cared for. You normally bathed them and taught them to lead, so you'd have them in position to show them at the county fair. You'd put them on a leash and lead them around the ring is how they were displayed, so the judge could judge which calf was best in his opinion. And as I got older, then a couple of years we took calves that I had shown up to the state fair and where they were shown up there. But after the show was over, the calves were simply sold at auction, and I was allowed to keep the proceeds for the sale, so I got some money in my bank account every year
Gotcha.
from taking care of my calf. And I was in 4-H for 7 years until I went to Iowa State in Ames in 1953 to study animal husbandry.
Wow. And so were the fairs, were these like big social events, like this is where the whole town just shows up and mingles, or?
Yeah, they were a big county fair, and they had a carnival, and it drew a lot of people, and so people would come out, and they'd walk through the livestock barns to see the animals, see the horses and the pigs and the cattle and the sheep and whatever people had there to show, as well as they would go to the carnival, and then they used to have a grandstand show, and they would have and they had a track there, and a couple days of the show they would have horse racing where they race on the horse and buggy racing, where they had these little horse carts behind. It wasn't the horse where you rode on the horse there. It was they pulled these little carts behind. The jockey would be on the cart, urging his horse around the track. And so 2 days were horse racing, and 1 day would be car racing, automobile racing. And so they would have automobile races around this track at the fairgrounds. And so you buy tickets to sit in the grandstand and watch the races. And or my dad had it figured out in a pickup truck, and he could park it down fairly near the racetrack and put a seat up on top of the back of the truck. And so we'd sit on top of the truck and watch the races many times. We didn't want to pay for the grandstand tickets.
For free. That's the move. How did people like farm kids? How did they have social lives? How did they, how do you go hang out with your friends or like have a girlfriend, boyfriend, like if you're so far away from everyone?
Our social life was pretty restricted on the farm. I mean, there were things to do, and you go to church, and there were church gatherings that they would have. Usually Sunday night was a church night. As you got a little bit older, and the kids would go there and mingle and do different kinds of things, but pretty restricted. And so I grew up, I think, maybe a little more shy and less exposed than somebody that intermingled with a lot of kids when they were young.
How do you think that changed your perspective? Because now you're a pretty open social guy, and
yeah, well, I had to work on it.
Yeah.
And you went through college, and of course, as I got into the high school, you had more kids there. You had a few kids there for interaction, but again, you lived on the farm, and so it wasn't that easy just to run into town. But my dad did get me a car at early age. I think at 14 I had a car, and I could drive to school.
Sure.
And back, but you couldn't drive elsewhere. 16, then you were kind of...
Did you ever drive elsewhere without telling him?
Not much at that point. Okay. At 16, then I could drive, and we had a big gasoline tank to fill the tractors up, and back then they didn't really keep track of it, and so we could fill the car up at the same time.
Wow.
And so I had a car with kind of an unlimited supply of gasoline available to me if I wanted to
Oh, that's really nice.
go roaming around. And that was how our socialization worked. Movies and drive-in theater were
Oh, yeah.
a big thing. So that was
Go to the
typically
drive-in.
typically a date if you want to take a girl. You go to the movies or go to drive-in theater with her.
Who was your first girlfriend? Long time ago.
Trying to think. A girl named Nancy Day was one that I dated quite a bit.
How old were you?
Well, that was more college days.
College age. Okay.
I didn't really date much at all when I was in high school.
Yeah.
I may have had a handhold or something like that once in a while, but by college, and when I went away to Iowa State, followed my dad's guidance a lot, and he'd gone to Iowa State for only about a year and a half or 2 years, and he had joined a fraternity, Alpha Gamma Rho, which was an agricultural fraternity. It was all farm kids.
Okay, so you're with your people.
And they would only take people in that had an agricultural interest. Now, you could be in about any kind of ag. You could be in ag journalism. You could be in ag agronomy. You could be in ag engineering. But you had to have an ag degree to join the fraternity. Now, once you joined the fraternity, you remember for life. And so if you wanted to switch your major and go to business school or something there after that, you could. And my animal husbandry gave me a lot of things were difficult. You had to learn a lot of anatomy of animals. Bacteriology was my toughest course.
What is that?
That's study of all the diseases and all the bacteria and how to...
In animals that you would have to...
but it's just sort of general education. A medical student would start out doing the same thing. You have to learn about bacteriology and a lot of things like that. Also, I struggled with chemistry. Chemistry was probably
I don't like chemistry either.
my hardest subject, especially the inorganic chemistry. It was on a semester system, and I had to take 3 semesters of inorganic chemistry, and I had to take 2 semesters of organic chemistry.
Mm.
Now, organic chemistry was easier for me, and I did better with that. But
why do you think that was?
I don't know. At that point, I was sort of learning to study.
Okay.
In high school, it was very easy just to sit there and listen to what the teacher had to say, and pretty well remember what was going on. You could do okay in my tests without a lot of studying. And my pastime back and before television and things like that, I loved comic books. Mm. And so we'd go to the store. My mom normally went to the store once a week to buy groceries and things that we needed to add to the farm. Oh, and we took eggs, and we had a lot of chickens, and so we raised eggs, and more than what we could use. And so we saved these eggs down in the basement. They were kept, and we packaged them up in cartons, and we took them into the grocery store, and Mom got paid for the eggs she brought in.
Oh, wow. So you could just be like, hey, take my eggs to the grocery store?
Yeah, take your egg. And so,
that wouldn't work at Jewel or anything.
No, not these days. They don't allow that. But
like, huh?
but you pay extra for that kind of these days if you want to drive out to the farm and buy nice, fresh country eggs that haven't had anything done to them. You pay a lot of extra money to get that these days.
For sure.
So that was... growing up back then in the agriculture fraternity, again, I took animal husbandry, and so there was a lot of study of your animals and showing animals and what you did with them there.
And so what were you looking to gain out of that?
When I started school, my thought was I would go back to the farm and farm after I had finished my college.
And was that kind of like what everyone did?
Not necessarily, because as I reached my senior years, I had a lot of allergies, and that also kind of prevented me from wanting to go on the farm. And back in those days, the tractors didn't have all these heat, all these places. You were sheltered inside the. You drove down the field and you smelled all the oats and hay and whatever else you were trying to work and harvest, and so it bothered my allergies. And so I kind of was looking for something a little bit different. And also, I was single guy out on the farm. That wasn't too attractive a thing. And so a friend of mine got a job with Swift and Company selling meats. And so I'd taken meat courses, and I was on the meats judging team at Iowa State.
The meats judging team? What is it?
Oh, yeah, they'd line up a whole bunch of steaks there, and you'd have to select which ones were the better of these steaks.
Oh, they were working you like a dog there.
Yeah, well, it was kind of fun because you went to other, you'd go to meat packing plants.
Mm-hmm.
They put them out on display. You did judge these animal carcasses, which ones were the best, which ones weren't. We took some trips to Kansas City. We went to Fort Worth, Texas for meat judging. So it was a college-sponsored thing, and you got to go to these places, and so that was kind of a fun thing to do. We were in college, and so because I had quite a bit of meats, and I thought, well, and one of the attractive things about this sales job was they gave you a company car that you could use for your own personal use too. And so I think it's the worst decision probably that a person could do is select a job based on the fact that you were going to get a car, but without paying for it. But that's what I did.
Oh, okay.
And I went to work for this meat packing company. And John Morrell and Company was a local company in Ottumwa where my dad always sold his hogs and everything. It was I think there were like 5 big meat packing companies there, and it was probably 5th or 6th in size as far as all the.
Oh, wow.
So it was a large nationwide company, and so and my first job with the meat packing company was taking vacation routes. Salesmen would have a route, and they'd call in all these butcher shops around the territory, however much, and when they went on vacation, they still wanted coverage, and they wanted to be able to sell the products to these stores. They normally call in the stores on a weekly basis, and so because you got to keep meat fresh, you can't have a lot of old meat hanging around. So
like in Rocky, like.
Yeah. That was the carcasses. If somebody ordered a side of beef, it's just like what Rocky pounded on.
They would just bring half of a cow.
Yeah, you get half a cow.
Hang it up.
And that was the trick, is to being able to carve it up and do a good job. You don't really find that very much today. If you want a really good steak or a really good piece of meat carved by a butcher that knows what he's doing, it's very hard to find. Most of it is done by machine. When you go into Kroger these days, it's all done either at the factory, where they cut all this thing up into steaks and put it in packages, and a lot of stuff is prepackaged at the factory because it's more efficient. The assembly line comes down there and chop, chop, chop. This guy's chopping pork chops all day long, or this machine is doing it because it becomes more automated all the time. But back then we had to call on these butcher shops all the time, and so when again somebody went on vacation, that I would pull into town and check into the hotel, do a Dewey's route for 2 weeks, and then I go on to the next town. So that was my first job with Morrell, going around. And
how far were you traveling?
Well, southern Iowa, northern Missouri, and Kansas City, and into Kansas were some of the routes. I think the farthest I got at that point was Topeka, Kansas. Now, one thing in between there, when I was in college, it was mandatory if you went to a land-grant college that if you were single, you had to be an ROTC, and Reserve Officers Training Corps, and you had to do 2 years of that. Okay. And it was mandatory, and so I think I was Air Force ROTC.
And what year is this?
This had been 1953 when I went to college, 53 and 54.
So Korea's When is Korea start?
Korea was about the same time period. If you
Okay.
went to college, you weren't called up to go to Korea.
Okay.
So that was a reason to stay in college back then, is that you weren't sent off to a shooting war right away.
And were people scared of Korea among that you knew, or?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. They didn't. No one wanted to go, really, or.
Well, you can't say no one, because some people were very patriotic and they felt it was their duty to take up arms like their dad had in World War II and to fight. But I wasn't anxious to go to Korea.
Okay.
And Korea actually is one of our success stories anyway. At least we created a country there that is stable and a productive country.
Except for the top half of it.
Yeah, the top half of it didn't work
we
out
did
too
an
well.
okay job. We did 50%.
That's because the politicians chickened out. But that was another story for another time about why the top half got divided anyway. But Roosevelt and Truman Roosevelt wasn't very strong. Roosevelt's the one that gave it away. And he was an old dying man at the point that they were dividing up the spoils after World War II. And Stalin was very strong and aggressive, and
he kind of bullied him.
Roosevelt kind of keeled over on the thing.
Yeah, probably no one realized how crazy of a decision that would be now, and how there's just so many people.
All of these decisions that are made after wars and during wars create tremendous consequences for people. It's unbelievable. And I was in the Army Reserves. I did the ROTC for 2 years, and I didn't like to march. I didn't like it, and so I dropped out after 2 years. Now, if you stayed in 2 more years, you could have become an officer. And an officer was a much better position than going in as a private enlisted man. In the airport, you got paid more, and you had a lot more privileges.
Gotcha.
So I didn't know much of the difference between officers and enlisted men. All the family and things that I knew at that point had been enlisted men in the Army in World War II, and so I didn't think too much about being an officer. I probably should have thought more about it, except for a couple things that happened that maybe I was lucky not following through with that. One of my friends in the fraternity, he went through the Air Force ROTC and did his 4 years, got his commission, was sent off to an air base in Kansas, and the first summer he was flying in an airplane, and over Kansas the airplane blew up and everybody in the airplane died. And if I'd gone through the same program, I said I could have been sitting right beside him. So you just never know. The military pays you pretty well, they take care of you pretty well, and you think, well, this is a pretty good deal until they start shooting at you. And you say, how the hell did I get there? Here.
Wow.
But so as I neared the end of college, and if I did stay in or do anything else, I was subject to the draft. They were going to draft me, and I would have to go into the service for 2 years. And there was an opportunity, the reserves were offering an opportunity, since they'd had 2 years of ROTC, they'd give you the PFC rank, which was 2 grades up from E1, E2, E2, E3, and E1. So PFC was the 3rd rank up from the bottom. So that was a little bit better than being the lowest guy on the totem pole. And so the program there was you joined the reserves, and you had to go to these meetings. And they had a meeting once a week you had to go to, and you'd put your uniform on and march around or do whatever they decided for you to do. So I did that, but then you had to put in 6 months worth of active duty. And so then I was taken in for active duty for 6 months and went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And my basic training went pretty well. I think I went in November and got out in May. And back then, I can still remember the smoke. They had all these Army barracks there, and they were all done with coal-fired stoves and furnaces in there. They were warm and everything was good, but I can still remember the overhang of the smoke at the military base. We were out there at 5:30 in the morning doing our calisthenics, and you smell all this smoke still hanging around. And shortly after I left, I think they converted that all to gas
Okay.
furnaces,
Yeah.
so it wasn't nearly as sneaky as it was back then. But,
How were they training you? Like, what was like I know there's physical requirements today. Was it the same as it was back then?
pretty much same today, and they were probably tougher on you then than they are now, because it's a volunteer force now, and it's probably easier for guys to get out of it now than back then. So I think they're a little less rigid, but you did a lot of marching, you did a lot of running. I'm probably more physically fit than I ever was in my life back then.
Really?
You had to do pull-ups before you went to lunch hall. They fed you really well.
That's good.
So there was good food during basic training, but anyway, I got out like in May, and back to my job at Morrell. They put me on another assignment of going and taking these vacation routes, and in the reserves, you had to attend meetings. As long as you were around Ottumwa, no problem going to the meetings. I had a unit in Ottumwa that I belonged to. And they said, I said, what do I do when I'm in southern Missouri or in Kansas or something like that? Oh, well, all you do is just take your uniform with you in the car, and you find a reserve unit there. You call them up and say, can I go for training? They'll say, sure. And so you can do your training there.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I wasn't bright enough to know was that you had to make sure when you went to this reserve unit that they made out a proper piece of paperwork and sent it back to your commanding officer so he knew you took training. And I was just assuming, blindly assuming that happened. I went to training, that they took care of that, and I went back to training. In about September 1958, I get a little notice from the draft board saying you have not been attending your meetings. Your commanding officer turned you in for not going to meetings, and that we're going to induct you back into the service for 2 more years because you didn't complete your reserve duty. And I didn't know what to do at that point, but I talked to my boss at Morrell and my company commander at Ottumwa. He also worked for Morrell, so they kind of worked it out. But anyway, they said, well, what we'll do for you, you've got to go to these meetings, and the best thing I can do for you, I can transfer you to Chicago. There are a lot of territories in Chicago, and it's a bigger city, and so you can have your route and you can be available for meetings every year. And so that's how I got to Chicago.
So you moved to the big city.
And so they moved me to the big city, and I worked from around. I continued that for another couple of years, but really wasn't doing well and didn't really like it that well. And so another thing that I sort of think maybe I dodged the bullet with is that he had to sell. They wanted hot dogs and bologna and all that kind of stuff, and we had these called little weenie cookers. And you go into the grocery store and you stick your hot dog in this weenie cooker, you'd plug it in, it would cook up real nice and warm. You're supposed to take it out and take your sausage knife and cut it a little bit. Isn't this good? Wouldn't you like to taste it, Mr. Butcher, and buy some of this? And so did a lot of tasting of these beets with nitrates in.
Oh.
And again, I left after 2 years and went to other pursuits, but after 3 years, I think it was. But I had a friend that was doing the same thing for another meatpacking company, and he stayed with it for his lifetime, and he ended up dying of leukemia. So
wow.
I sort of think, he said I was perfectly healthy, and all of a sudden I got really sick. And I think that maybe eating all these nitrates all these years, plus if you're selling the stuff, you're going to eat your own bacon, and you're going to have eat a lot of this stuff as well as what you sampled. So it just was
ended up catching up.
Another thing that maybe caught up with, maybe didn't, maybe what happened anyway. Some things you just never know, but it's kind of a interesting thought process.
So you leave. You grew up you grew up 6 miles outside of a town of like 400 people, right? So very small.
Yeah.
And then it's you and your brother Clark, right?
Right.
And then Clark stays at the farm, and you go to the big city. How was that Did he feel left out? Did he feel you were leaving behind, or?
I think he felt it was a wonderful opportunity.
Oh, okay.
he was the only farmer, and he could, if we were, he always wanted me to come back. And so I considered a couple times coming back to the farm, but never quite made the move. Once you kind of become cityfied, it's a little harder
to go back.
To go back, and so I never made the move to come back to the farm.
Mm-hmm.
But it was possible for a while, at least until my dad retired. He had a lot of machinery, and so I could have taken over his machinery when he retired. And
but you were already in your own thing?
No, I was doing my own thing at that point. I worked for the meat packing company for 3 years. Then I went to work for Sun Oil Company. Sunoco gas stations were a big thing back in
Gotcha.
Chicago at that point. Sunoco was an East Coast company, but they were trying to push into Chicago. And so so I worked for them for 7 years, leasing gas stations, and basically I had a territory of probably 20 stations. You had to call on your dealers. You had to make sure that they had to take a dipstick and dip down in the gasoline tank to make sure that they were not cheating on what they were paying for gasoline.
Gotcha.
As well as handle their complaints. My lift here isn't working right in my garage. Get somebody out to fix it. You were supposed to sell tires and other products to the gas stations back then. And I got out of that in 1967, I think.
So when did you meet Grandma?
I met Grandma when I was still with Burrell. That was another bit of a story. When I transferred to Chicago, single guy, and I'd been staying in hotels. And my new boss in Chicago said, "We can't pay for hotels anymore. You've got to find yourself someplace to live."
Okay.
And I would suggest you start off in a YMCA. And so he took me to a couple YMCAs, and there was one in Oak Park, Illinois, that looked kind of nice to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stayed in the YMCA in Oak Park. And somewhere along the line, someone told me that Northwestern University is right downtown near the lake, and that they have dormitory rooms, and when they're not rented out to students, then they'll let other people rent them and live there.
Oh, wow.
And I think I was taking a night class at Northwestern at that time. I took a night class. I didn't really stick with it, but I thought I'd get another education. But spending the whole day in the car and out calling all these, you got back, you retired at night, you didn't really want to study, and so I didn't. But I did move into this dormitory, and it was beautiful. 710 North Lakeshore Drive, and they had a nice cafeteria there. You could sit and eat your breakfast and look out over the lake, and
wow,
it was a beautiful place to live, and very reasonable. And so,
what was your rent?
Oh, I don't remember what it was. I was only making $80 to $100 a week back then, and so it was some portion of that was a reasonable number that I could afford anyway, $15 or $20.
$15 or $20 a week?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh my God, people would just love that.
Yeah, well, that's inflation for you. That's the government printing money and putting all this debt out there, and I'm going to give you this, and always going to put it on the national credit card. It just gets getting bigger and bigger. But anyway, and so when I was there, and Grandma loves this story, I said, "Well, where do you go to meet girls here?" "Oh, go over to Fourth Presbyterian Church."
To go to the church.
It's a big church on Michigan Avenue, and they have a youth program, and they had what they call the Forthcomers program. So kids between 18 and 24 would go there on Sunday evenings, and they'd have different programs. They had a minister that kind of ran it, and so it was a big youth program. And I went over there. Mom was over there, and my wife Suzanne was over there, and she was the prettiest girl right around at that point, I thought. And so asked her out on a date, and went on for that. And so then we were married probably, I think I met her in June, and we were married the following April.
Oh, wow. Very quick.
Yeah, it wasn't really quick, but it was...
today's standard, very quick.
In today's standards, yeah, when kids date for years.
Yeah. Wasn't there some kind of weird thing with some rich dude or something that you won out or something like that?
Yeah, well, she dated some guys that were pretty classy, sort of. There were one fellow was a dental student at Northwestern, and he was a Navy officer, and and he invited her to come out to San Diego and go to a dance with him on Coronado Island, and
Wow.
and she did that once, and I said, "Can I pick you up when you come back?" And I felt her hand. She wasn't engaged, so.
So you didn't. Wow. That always blew my mind because the fact that you could have engaged her or this other guy could have engaged her at the same time is just like normally if you're gonna get engaged you kind of know, but at that point it was just like, whoever gets her first, man.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure he was ready to be engaged. He was ready to go overseas for deployment and this kind of thing, and so I don't think he was interested in getting married at that point.
So how'd you win her over?
Just my good looks.
She always talks about how she couldn't resist.
Yeah, and she also had another boyfriend that was kind of well known. There's a big restaurant downtown Chicago called Berghoff's. And Berghoff's is an old German restaurant that had been in the family, and she and her girlfriends had gone over there for lunch, and this fella kind of paying attention to her, and he was Louis Berghoff, one of the kids.
Oh my gosh.
And so she dated him a few times too. And so I had competition.
You had competition, but you won her over.
Yeah. So.
Even with his wealth. So then you switched you have a new job, right?
Yeah, I spent 7 years with the oil company, and
then when do you move out of the city?
During the time period that we were going to Fourth Church, yeah, I was in the this Abbott Hall, but come time for school in September, then they gave everybody notice you got to move out because we've got students coming in, and then maybe you could move back in after that. But so a bunch of guys moved out, and there was an apartment with 5 guys on Irving Park Road, and we lived above a funeral home.
Oh goodness.
Nice apartment, very satisfactory for me. But
was that weird? Was there weird voodoo going on? Do you see ghosts?
Well, sort of. It kind of impressed Grandma though, because her dad worked for undertakers.
What is that?
Well, he was a fireman. Okay. And so firemen have a lot of time off, and so the undertakers might need somebody to pick up bodies or to haul people around and things like that.
They call him the Undertaker too? That's
well, he wasn't the undertaker. He didn't do the embalming, but he moved the bodies around.
Oh goodness, that's a job right there.
And so she was kind of impressed. He came in and stayed with me one night up at the funeral home.
He's like, "Oh, she'll just as home."
Yeah. So that was kind of a natural thing, but. So somewhere along there, one of the guys in church said, "I've got this nice apartment in Cicero, Illinois, and I'm going to be moving up. Would you be interested in staying here, in taking over my apartment and leasing it?" And I thought, well, didn't want to spend that much money on my own, whatever they were charging for rent, but maybe if I got a roommate, we could swing it. And so I went back to the YMCA where I had met fellows before I moved downtown, and found a fellow there, and so he and I rented this apartment in Cicero. The interesting story about this apartment, it was owned by Al Capone at one time. Didn't find any buried bodies around. A nice old Polish lady owned it at this point. We rented a nice studio apartment out of this.
Oh my goodness!
And so that's when Mom and I were dating. And so, as we were getting closer to marriage and engaged and everything, we found another apartment in the neighboring town next door, Berwyn, which was a nice English basement apartment. And so we moved into Berwyn.
Were you married at that point, or you
just... Yeah, we got married.
Got married. So you wouldn't really move in with a woman until you married her.
No, I did not move in with any. But I guess we did own the place together. But yeah, we didn't cohabitate for any time period there.
How was the transition there from just being a single dude and then all of a sudden you're living with your wife and you're like, whoa, hello.
She was wonderful. She could cook, and I never did really learn how to cook.
No.
And so, if you live single for a while, you learn to cook a little bit. But I never really lived enough single. The fellow that I roomed with in this sister row apartment, he was a pretty good cook.
Mm-hmm.
Or good enough that we got by with anyway. I don't know whether he was a good cook or not, but he knew a little bit more about shopping for groceries and buying things than I did at that point.
Wow. Okay.
And so then we lived there for a while, and then the people that owned the apartment building, it was a 2-flat, apartment up above and apartment down below, and so they sold the building, and the new people moved in there, and they said, well, I think we want to move our parents down into the bottom section of this, and so we had to move out, and so then we moved to an apartment in Forest Park.
Okay.
And Forest Park, again, was just another neighboring suburb there. And that's where Beth, our first baby, was born.
Oh.
When we lived in Forest Park. And at that point, I was working for Sun Oil. And one of the fellows, a little more advanced in money than I was, had a home in Elmhurst, which was, again, quite a bit west at that point.
Yeah.
Not anymore. It's in the middle of the city almost.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he had a nice 3-bedroom brick ranch there, and said I can sell it to you. So we bought our first house from him.
How much was that first house?
For $20,500.
Wow.
3-bedroom brick ranch.
Wow. And
two-car garage on the back.
Wow.
No basement. Had an attic. And one of these pull-down stairs, you pull down the stairs to go up into the attic. And so that's where we lived for a number of years till 1977.
Oh, so
we moved in there, I think, in 63. Beth was probably close to a year old at that point.
Wow, so there was a large portion of like Beth and my dad's childhood that were in Elmhurst.
Yeah. Beth went, she was freshman in high school when we moved.
Oh.
And your dad, wherever he was junior high.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, probably 6th or 8th.
Why did you end up moving to Itasca?
Mom always wanted a bigger house. Suzanne always wanted a bigger house.
Okay.
And the house we bought there really wasn't that much bigger, but it had a nice basement.
Mm-hmm.
Had a nice great big walk-in attic, and it gave us a lot more space, and it also had 4 bedrooms.
Mm.
And so that gave each of the kids a bedroom, and so that made life a little bit easier for everybody.
Who was sharing a room?
Grandma and I.
Well,
4 bedrooms.
Well, yeah, but one in your previous one was my dad and Blair together.
Your dad and Blair were together. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Cool. Bunk beds.
Bunk beds.
Yeah. That was all that would work in that little house. But, yeah. And so that's when we moved to Itasca, and we lived there till we sold that house in 2016 or 17, something like that.
Wow. So yeah, so you start raising kids, you move out, you're in Itasca, then somehow you get into finance.
Oh, when I worked for Sun Oil Company, things were going pretty well for a while, and Sun was pouring money into the Chicago area, but things kind of went a little awry for them, and they quit investing, making better stations and this kind of stuff. It was, you could see the handwriting on the wall. It wasn't really, Sun wasn't going anywhere.
Sure.
And so at that point, I read an article in the paper that, or someplace I saw an ad, would you like to be a stockbroker?
Feel like it.
And so I followed through on that a little bit and got hired by a company called Shearson Hamel, which was a stock brokerage back at that point. Most of them were private firms back then, not the big public companies that are brokerages now. And and they had a good training program at that point. Since then, they found these training programs were too expensive and they're running through brokers really fast, but and they've cut them down to 3 months. But it was a 6-month training program there. And it was 3 months studying books in Chicago, learning about stocks and accounting and different things you needed to know. And then you went to New York and you lived 3 months in New York.
Wow.
And so I had a roommate that was with me that we shared a room in a little hotel in what they call Brooklyn Heights, which was right across the river from Wall Street. And so you take the subway across to Wall Street and go to do our classes and live in Brooklyn Heights, which was a nice experience.
So you're in New York.
Yeah, New York City, and
Wow.
back then it was pretty good, pretty safe. We'd ride the subways all night to go to Times Square and all that kind of stuff at night, and never worried about anything.
So what year is this?
1967 and early 68.
And you're living in New York City?
Lived in New York City for 3 months.
Oh, and so grandma's taking care of the kids
Yeah,
back
grandma's home taking care of the kids.
Wow. How
Yeah.
was that? That's probably pretty hard because you had, what, 3 of them at that point? Something like that?
No, 2 at that point.
2?
Blair was born in 70.
Oh, okay. 2.
We had 2 at that point. And I think during this you got 1 trip home, and I think we reversed it, and Mom came out to see me for
Oh, okay.
a weekend.
Just want to
out
go
there.
see some New York.
Yeah. So,
That's cool.
yeah, I think it was over Thanksgiving.
Oh,
And
nice.
so, yeah, she came out over Thanksgiving weekend, and she got to spend a little time in New York
Yeah, no, that's nice.
out of that, so that worked out. And then I completed my training like in April, and worked as a stockbroker, and never did particularly well at it. You buy stocks and they go up and they go down, and seemed like every time I picked one out, it usually went down. And I worried a lot more about the stock loss than my customers did. My customers really weren't quite as upset about it that I was, but it really made me feel bad about the fact that I'd lost somebody some money.
Yeah.
And so I never could get particularly excited about selling stocks. And so I made a change and thought, well, maybe a different firm would help me. The companies all came up with these recommended lists. You can buy this stock and buy that stock and sell this and buy that. And they weren't right very often. And so I thought, well, I'll switch over to Dean Witter, which was another privately owned brokerage firm at that point. And I stayed with them a couple of years. And things weren't really going any better. And at some point they cut the amount they were paying you in commissions. They cut back the percentage what you were getting out of the trades, unless you were doing a big volume of business, and I wasn't. And so I said, well, I got to get out of this. I'm not making enough to feed the family and get along. And so one of my friends had left the brokerage and gone to work for First National Bank Chicago, selling bonds. And I called him up and said, what kind of opportunity? Well, if I hear of anything, I'll let you know.
Okay.
And so at that point, all of a sudden I get a call one day that somebody's left our individual sales unit where we're selling bonds to individual people, and they're looking to hire somebody. And so I came in, interviewed, and got hired for that job by kind of a crazy man at that point. He was Scott Stewart III.
Scott Stewart III.
And that was a family that had founded Quaker Oats. Stewarts had founded Quaker Oats.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. So they had money.
So they had a lot of money, and the family was all rich.
And a lot of oats.
And he was a crazy rich kid.
Oh.
But his dad at that point was on the board of directors of First National Bank, and so as being the chairman of Quaker Oats, they try and get all these company chairmen on board, and so he was pretty well protected and
Classic.
taken care of as long as the dad had the job. And he was kind of a womanizer.
Oh, wow.
And so finally, when the dad lost it, the dad retired from the board, and they retired Scott. But I ended up being in the right place at the right time. There was what we call individual sales, and there was institutional sales. And I kind of was envious of people in institutional sales, but at some point along the line, bank decided we don't want it. Institutional sales, we're calling on smaller banks, selling bonds to smaller banks, which is a little more glamorous kind of position. You had a bigger expense account, but they decided to get out of the business. They weren't making any money there. And so all of a sudden, they let all those people go. And my job was protected in individual because I had all these wealthy customers. And the bank was a great place to gather customers because you had all these wealthy people that came to the bank because our walls were about that thick and they felt their money was safe.
Yeah.
And pretty protective at that point. And so anyway, I ended up spending 31 years at the bank. Now the bank merged. At one point, it merged to a big bank in Detroit, MBD, first Chicago, Detroit, and then after that, they sold out to Bank One in Ohio, and the guy that ran Bank One in Ohio was a crazy dude, and he thought he was king.
Oh, wow.
And he got into, bought this big bank in Chicago, and he lived on the top floor, and he thought he could do anything. And so Mayor Daley, who controlled Chicago like a thumb, at that point wanted to close Meigs Airport.
Meigs Airport?
Which was an airport just off of the coast. And this guy lived in Ohio, and he used to fly his airplane into Meigs Airport and quick hop over to the... So he opposed Mayor Daley.
Oh, you don't want to do that.
And that cost the bank a lot of business. At that point, the bank had its ATMs in all the airports and all the train stations, this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden, Bank America and other banks were in those locations.
Uh-oh.
And a lot of other sections that I don't even know about. It cost the bank a lot of money when he opposed Mayor Daley about closing this Meigs Air. And so Meigs Airport and that island is now what they call Northerly Island in Chicago. And so, but anyway, and he ran the bank way downhill, and one of the wealthy families was the Crown family, that they founded General Dynamics and this kind of stuff. And James Crown was on the board, and he helped select Jamie Dimon, who was a savior of the bank and the savior of a lot of jobs and everything like that. And Jamie had kind of an interesting experience too. He was a bright young guy, and he worked for a guy named Sandy Weil. And Sandy Weil took him with him from a loan company all the way through to Citibank. And Sandy was the chairman of Citibank, and Jamie was the president of Citibank. And somewhere along the line, proteges, they disagreed, and I think that Sandy wanted him to promote to a high vice presidency his daughter. And Jamie said, she's not qualified, I don't want her in that job, and he ended up firing Jamie. So Jamie was out of a job for a year or so. And James Crown found Jamie, brought him in, and he took over the bank, and he brought us back to a healthy condition, and then smartly merged us into JP Morgan. All the New York banks had merged at that point, and so we became a very large, powerful bank, and stock prices appreciated very nicely. And all the time I worked for First Chicago, I had 10% of my income taken out buying JP Morgan stock. And JP Morgan stock wasn't worth too much back then, but I always felt it was a good, well, they gave you a really good deal to buy it. They gave you, they would pick a time period, they'd lock the stock price in, You would buy whatever you could buy over a 2-year time period, and out of your payroll, you paid for this. At the end of the 2 years, if the stock was below whatever you paid for it, you didn't have to take it. You could just take the money. Or usually it was above whatever you've been paying for it over this time period, and so you kept the stock. And so I accumulated a lot of bank one stock back then. But I used a lot too. When I needed to buy a new car, I had to sell some stock. When my kids go to college, I had to sell some stock. And so I sold a lot of stock over that time period that I still had. Be even better than now, but it's been a fantastic ride. So it was probably in the 20s or 30s back then. Now it's 150.
Wow.
So it's had a pretty good run over the time period, and pays a pretty nice dividend. And
so I noticed you get a little emotional talking about Jamie Dimon. Why do you think that is?
just because he was so good for the bank, and that he came in at the right time, and a very practical man that made good decisions. So many of these guys are in running these corporations that it's kind of all for them. Mm-hmm. And whatever they can do to boost their bonus, they're going to make a bigger profit this year. The bonus will be bigger. They make a lot of short-term decisions. Jamie came with a very practical approach, and he interviewed every department manager, asked them how they made their money, how they operated their department. And if they didn't know how they made their money and how they operated their department, they were gone. And he basically told them that if you see something that should be done, we want to do it, no matter what it costs. Within whatever we can afford, but we don't want any more short-term decisions. We want to do things based on the long-term health of the institutions and bank, and that has worked out very well over the years. And just very happy with what he's been able to do for the bank, and the fact he's, I don't always agree with everything he's done, but he's done the right thing. You know.
It's changed
in 80 or 90% of the situations, and so your dad went to work with me in the bank close to 25 years ago now, and it was pretty unusual. It didn't usually happen, but I had a boss at that point that it's a good idea, and she allowed it to happen. It happens in brokerage firms. It doesn't happen very much in banks. Called nepotism, and they don't usually allow that. Mm-hmm. But they allowed it. Your dad got to work for the bank, and so he's still after 25 years. Again, mostly I sold tax-exempt bonds, and bonds paid a pretty good rate of interest during the time period I was there, and interest rates moved a little lower, and so people made money on their bonds, and it was a really good time to be there and be doing that. Now interest rates have gotten so low that there's not much money in bond business anymore, and stock business is non-existent as far as profit, because you can trade for nothing. You go to these brokerage firms and you can buy 10 shares of stock and not pay a commission, or whatever you want to do, or buy 100,000 shares of stock and not pay any commission. And so there's no profit made in trading stocks anymore and selecting stocks for people in that manner. The only thing that makes money is managed money. And so you've got to accumulate money that people will pay you a fee to manage their money for you. And so that's how he makes his living now. And most of it, I mean, he still sells a few bonds and things, but interest rates are so low that they're not a practical decision for most people. When inflation rates are running higher than what the interest rate on the bonds are, it's not a very good decision.
I would talk to my dad about that. I'm like, so you can sell me a bond at 2%, but inflation's 7%? Like, I'm just losing money. Like, why would I do that?
And that's all the Federal Reserve and the government and the Biden administration looking to keep interest rates low, looking to keep people happy, because they get low mortgage rates and they can borrow cheaply and keep companies going. The Federal Reserve is pumping all this money into the system that is a mistake, in my opinion. So
the low interest rates are cause in in the end cause a lot more inflation.
Yeah. In the end, will cause a lot more inflation, a lot more problems, and perhaps they needed them for a while to stimulate the economy, but they've kept them on far too long.
Because it's still like, what, 0%, isn't it, basically?
Well, you buy a 10-year government bond, it's almost up to 2% now.
Okay. Wow.
And short-term money is, it's almost zero. You get almost nothing on your checking account.
Mm-hmm.
I keep a fairly substantial sum in the checking account, and I may get 5 cents at the end of the month.
Jeez. Interesting. What would you suggest we need to change in order to like we need to start raising that interest rates?
Well, they've got a program to do that. The Federal Reserve announced the Federal Reserve has been buying bonds on the open market in order to keep the interest rate low.
Okay.
The government can set those rates wherever they want to if they want to buy it. And I always wondered how they did that in World War II. Interest rates didn't go high in World War II, even though we borrowed a tremendous amount of money based on what we were able to pay at that time. And it was the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody wanted to buy a bond, they sold it. If somebody wanted to sell a bond, they bought it back in.
Yeah.
So if you maintain the market
Mm-hmm.
in the bonds, the interest rates don't move. But if you take your hands off of it, and investors say, "Is this a good place to park my money?" Not when interest rates are 7%, and I only get 2% on my.
Yeah. You've experienced a lot of administrations. What do you think? What were some of the most memorable elections where it just felt like this was going to be monumental for the country?
How you feel based on the advertising and the promotions and this kind of stuff. I was very pleased when Trump got elected, and I think he did the right thing for the country. And the other people run at that point. The Clintons, Hillary Clinton ran around the world as a U.S. representative and collecting money from all these governments because they thought she'd be the next president. And there was huge money built up in the Clinton Foundation to boost her run for the presidency. And I think people could see that. They were sick of it. And that's why she didn't win. She essentially actually stole that race from Bernie Sanders. They were so fed up with her, and Bernie Sanders was a socialist, but he was honest, I think.
Yeah.
An honest socialist. He said what he believed, and he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And
no one likes a liar.
Yeah, and so he should have won the race, and he should have been the one competing against Trump.
Which that would have been a really interesting race.
Yeah, but so Hillary won, and people were just sort of, and also I felt she'd had her turn in the White House. We limited our president to 2 years, and so she wasn't the president during Bill, but she certainly was very influential in whatever decisions were made. Mm-hmm. At that point, and I felt she'd had her 2 years, that she wasn't entitled to another run.
Gotcha. Do you remember, because I know one of the bigger elections was the Reagan election. Do you remember the energy around that? Because it is one of the most, during that election, was one of the most dominant electoral college elections. Like, in 80, Reagan probably had, I think, 85-90% electoral college, and then in 84 he had like over 95% of the electoral college, which that's bonkers today where it's so close every year.
Reagan made an awful lot of good decisions, and I think he was a good president, and we moved forward in those years and made progress. He wasn't so much for handing out all this money to everybody that didn't deserve it. Mm-hmm. You can't say that he was 100% clean because everybody.
Yeah.
In order to keep your position and to keep people that are supporting you happy, you've got to make some compromises, and so I'm sure he had to too. But Jimmy Carter was pretty incompetent, unadept at doing it. I thought he would be pretty good when he went in, but. Mm-hmm. Because he'd been a governor of a state, and I like state governors as opposed to senators and congressmen, because they've had experience running a political machine and dealing with a lot of different moving parts.
You get like the life part of it too.
Yeah, life
you're
part of it.
dealing with humans and not just law.
Right. And so generally, I liked him. Lyndon Johnson got himself in so much trouble with that Vietnam War.
Oh yeah.
You know, that's what he saw he couldn't win, and he got out of office.
And so, I mean, a lot of kids these days, they struggle, I think, with self-image and where they're trying to get their worth from. And you know, you've had a long, fulfilling life on this earth. Like, how do you derive your self-worth to this day at 85, almost 86 years old?
I have been very fortunate. I've been in the right place at the right time. Enough times in my life that I'm comfortable now, and I just try and help people whenever I can. I guess I try to be helpful. I try and get my grandkids started with some sort of a saving program where they build a little bit of money up for retirement or whatever future needs they might have, and I think that's the main enjoyment I get out of things these days. When I can be helpful to a grandchild, I certainly try.
Thank you. What are some of your proudest moments that you've shared?
I don't know. I had some sales successes with the bank where I got awards and that kind of stuff. That was kind of at least something that you get recognized for. I never really worked too hard for that, and I think whenever I've had a good moment, I thank God for the fact that He put me in the right place at the right time to do these things. To marry Suzanne. She was wonderful in raising kids. Raised really three good, well-adjusted children. And their achievements would be my achievements. And there's no particularly one thing I think that stands out. A lot of little things, I guess, that we're very happy about. But I've had a very good life and been able to do a lot of things, more things I wish to do. I still am very proud of the fact that I've been able to keep my share of the farm in Iowa. Farmland I consider is like black gold. You get gold and it's got a preserved value and it's not going to go anywhere. Farmland is kind of like that, except it pays you income.
Like a little dividend.
Yeah. They can't print farmland and they can't print gold
Yeah.
at the printing press. And it is a huge tragedy what these governments have done. As far as I'm concerned, the best president I lived under was Eisenhower.
Wow.
He was a very level, easygoing kind of a guy. He didn't waste a lot of money. He saw all the excesses and all the problems that happened in World War II. And he cut back on those when he could. And his big crowning thing, as far as I'm concerned, was the interstate highway system.
Yeah.
We had no good interstate highway system back then. And so that was one thing he pushed for and got through during his presidency. And he was criticized by the Kennedys and the people that came after him. Well, he was so conservative and he didn't boost the money supply and people were unemployed. He could have employed more people and all that stuff causes inflation. And inflation is terrible for the conservative person that makes a few dollars and takes and puts it in the bank. Because it just eats it up.
Incentivizes spending.
And you purchase life insurance to protect you against disasters that might happen in the short term. As a long-term investment, it's terrible. When I got out of college, my dad was kind of a believer in insurance and got my first job and said, maybe you ought to buy an insurance policy. So, neighbor was a salesman for Farm Bureau Insurance, and so, yeah, I think my first job I was making $4,000 a year,
Wow.
and so I bought a $10,000 policy. That's a lot of money. That's 2.5 times what I'm making, and finally this year I had to stop making payments on it. You had to make payments on it until you were 85.
Oh my goodness.
The way the policy was set up. And so even though probably in the last 25 years or so, there have been enough dividends produced by the policy to meet the payments, so I didn't really take money out of my pocket making payments the last 25 or 30 years. But $10,000 won't buy anything today. Well, it was double my income back in.
Wow,
Yeah,
so you've been paying for 10 grand this whole time.
Yeah.
So you recommend don't get into insurance?
Well, insurance is necessary. When you're growing up and have a family, you want to protect them so they can keep their house and things like that. Something happens to you, it's necessary. But as far as a long-term investment, it is not.
Gotcha.
Buy a mutual fund, buy a stock, buy anything that will appreciate in value.
Oh, we were talking yesterday that you were kind of saying you're just trying to have fun, a little bit. What keeps you wanting to keep living to your fullest, keep having fun, even to this day after so long?
Well, the things I do here, I exercise, and with COVID, I don't go to the gym as much as I did, and if I do go, I try and go really early in the morning before other people are there, so that they require you to wear a mask in the gym, and it's not much fun with the mask on, and so I try and exercise with the mask on early in the morning before the crowd is there, so maybe people don't see me whether I'm wearing a mask or not. I try and climbed a mountain here in Arizona, which is a mountain down at the end of the street here. And it's about 275 vertical feet. It's not really that high, but it's enough to, you feel it by the time you get to the top.
Yeah.
And then I like to go for long walks.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to spend an hour a day exercising something or other, one of those pursuits. And then I like to play bridge. And it's a card game, and you've got to remember cards, and hopefully they'll keep me mentally active enough to
keep going.
I like being in Arizona. It's a nice, bright, sunshiny state, and I'm very fortunate to be in a place where we're at. So even in the summertime, it's a good place to be. It's a large building. We've got our gym in there. We've got our swimming pool in there. We've got places to play cards and have meetings. And we've got, right now it's only 2. They will open up another. There'll be 3 restaurants in there as well as a bar. And so you don't really need to go outside that building if you don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
In the summertime when it's really hot. And it's always pleasurable to go out, but I like to go out very early. I like to ride my bike very early in the morning when there's not much traffic on the streets. Because I was hit by a car one time riding my bike.
I do remember that. That was crazy. You lost skin on your whole leg.
Yeah. Well, I'm very fortunate.
Grandma lost half her hair that month.
Yeah. When I came up, stuck my head up underneath this Cadillac with 2 great big wide wheels that had not run over me.
Wow.
Another time when the Lord was protecting me, and I had a bad experience, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been.
100%. What do you want your legacy to be known as? What do you want to be remembered as? What do you want to leave? What message do you want to leave to your kids and your grandchildren and all of your descendants that go for however many hundreds more years possibly?
Work hard at whatever your pursuit is and take care of yourself. Don't expect the government or other people to take care of you. I see cases of that down here all the time. The homeless are down here. They've gotten addicted to drugs in most cases, or else they're just normally schizophrenic and can't take care of themselves. But it's a very sad situation, and I certainly wouldn't want one of my grandkids to ever be in that situation. And they've got to learn to produce income and to take care of themselves and hopefully raise families. And got one great grandchild now, which I'm very proud of, Luke.
Luke, shout out Luke.
And hopefully there'll be a few more in future years. I've got a step granddaughter getting married this summer, Allison Becker, and I've got son Patrick he's going to get out of the Navy. He's been in for like 11 years, and got to respect his decision. It seems like it'd be awfully nice to stay in the Navy for 20 years and be able to draw a pension when you get out, and then do what you want to do. But it's another 9 or 10 years out of your life, and if somebody's shooting at you, it is certainly no fun place to be. And also, in order to keep your marriage intact, it isn't really good to be gone for 8 or 9 months at a time at sea when
for sure
you be leaving your wife alone. So but I hope all my grandkids can find something to do that'll be productive and make a living for themselves, and not count on inheritances and things to make a living for them. If you inherit a little bit of something, then that might make things easier for you. It would have made Suzanne happier if we could have had a bigger house growing up, but I'm not sure that was necessary. There are wants and needs. My needs and my family's needs are pretty well taken care of. Their wants, maybe not.
Got you. Well, thank you for telling your story. That was amazing. I'm sure people will listen to this for years to come.
Thank you for listening to it. How long was it?
I don't know. Probably a little over an hour and a half. So, so you're going. Yeah, so thank you so much. That was cool. I mean, sure, it's the cool part about this is like, as long as the world doesn't explode, this could, 10 generations from now could hear who their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is. So that's pretty amazing.
I certainly wish I could have heard the story of my great-granddad that went to the gold rush.
Lorenzo, going to the gold rush.
Lorenzo.
Maybe we'll find it, figure something out, go through some records and find it. But,
I wrote that imaginary story.
You did?
Well, it's not totally imaginary. There was a book written about the gold rush and finding gold in California. And part of it was a story about the family from Iowa that went overland and with all their possessions and their horses and mules and whatever. And as all these things that were so wonderful and necessary, they put in the wagon. They had to discard them along the way as they ran out of water, as they ran out of. It was too hard on the oxen. Their oxen died because they'd been pulling too long and too hard.
There's actually a book. You should probably read the book because I was thinking about Lorenzo when I picked it up, but it was in my.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
Go for it. But it was in my dad's bookshelf, and it's about a sailor that leaves from Boston and goes to California in 1850. So,
okay.
Yeah.